Hi, my name is Bhumi. I am the founder and CEO at InteriMarket, and today's hot seat session is very, very important because we have Kat today joining us for a very critical topic. Now, the whole purpose of hot seat sessions is to really invite thought leaders and speak about some of the really critical topics in the industry that no one else seems to be talking about. Kat, thank you so much for joining us, and I would love for you to give us an introduction and tell us more about your journey.
Yeah, sure. So I think I have to admit that I'm a resourcing professional now. For a long time, I didn't. I thought I was still pretending at it. But I've been doing talent acquisition for best part of 16 years now, because obviously I'm really old. So I started out in the BPO sector. Completely different, managing big teams. Discovered I had a passion for business improvement and transformation, moved into that as a career in BPO, and then fell into resourcing because Reed hired me to come and run their HR shared service centres to fix them,
Right.
supporting massive contingent programs like the Royal Mail, as well as big perm programs like Transport for London.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of the rest is history. I've moved into a series of successive, bigger and more complex in-house director of resourcing roles until very recently, in the last 10 weeks, I decided to join the big bad world and set up my own TA consultancy, helping organizations figure out how to fix their ability to attract talent, both contingent and permanent.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been a really interesting journey. Feels like about 16 careers in one.
Yeah, absolutely. That's quite a journey as well, right? So you've kind of done it all, and now you're at the other end, really helping businesses doing something that, from what I hear and understand, is quite a hot topic and quite confusing. So well
Yeah,
done.
quite a challenging area, and certainly why I decided to set up my business from sitting on the other side of the chair, both on contingent and permanent. Unfortunately, a lot of consultants working in our space who have never been practitioners. And
Hmm.
it's really easy to come in with a cookie cutter model, and not really get it right. So hopefully we'll start to see more people taking that route of coming in to actually lend applied knowledge into companies.
Oh, absolutely. And that neatly leads on to my first question, which is about what does it actually take to become a contingent program manager, to help mid to large size businesses?
Yeah, quite a lot. So normally I'd love to give you a glib answer that says, oh, it's really straightforward. When it comes to contingent resourcing, you can't be an enthusiastic amateur. It's just too complicated.
Yeah.
So anybody that wants to move into running big contingent programs, whether they're sitting in procurement or sitting in finance or sitting in a HR team, you really need to do a lot of work up front.
Mm.
I worked with, a great example is I worked with a lady called Maria at a former company who was in procurement but had zero category experience on contingent, but really wanted to start to own that category. And Maria told me that it probably took about 12 to 15 months of working hand in hand with me and with the team that I had there for her to really learn, even as a very senior procurement professional, to really learn and understand the commercial side of the contingent world.
Mm.
Uh, and that was, excuse me, that was without her even learning about arguably the HR side of that. So
Right.
and so it's so multifaceted. You've got to build up confidence and expertise in tech, as there are many tech vendors out there. It can be bewildering for people if they've never done it before to even know where to start and to
Mm.
figure out which the good ones are as well,
Mm.
like yourself, obviously. Um, and then the other side of it is the commercial bit internally within companies. What does good look like when you're procuring contingent resources? What are the different models that you can use to procure contingent resources, and why would you use those models?
Mm.
A good example of that with a former company is that we set about creating from scratch a massive contingent workforce program to support about 6,500 contingent workers, mainly in the UK.
Mm.
But starting from scratch, we had to make a decision about, did we want to do the traditional route and procure a VMS and an MSP together, or do the two things separately? And we went for the second option.
Hmm.
That took a lot of convincing to get people internally who didn't even know what a VMS was to
Hmm.
understand why we did that. But the reason we did that is your VMS is like your marriage, as I look at it, whereas the MSP is a little bit more casual dating. You can get out of it after a few years and you don't have to like give away half the house.
Hmm.
But it takes a lot of understanding of the market, the technology, and the future forward planning of how's what I'm creating going to work, not today, because it's going to take 6 months to a year to implement it anyway, but how's it going to work 5, 6, 8 years in the future? Because that's the longevity of the relationship that you're getting into.
Yeah. So based on what you've just said, something popped up in my mind is, what about the products that are now coming into the market, like ourselves, that are ecosystems, that are part VMS, part everything, and have third-party ecosystem providers on there? What do you feel is their scope, or do you feel that that's too futuristic at this stage?
No, not at all. And actually, for anybody that's working in the talent acquisition space today at a senior level, that's a journey that actually they should be quite familiar with and pretty enthusiastic about. So if I compare that product evolution journey to ATSs, so applicant tracking systems for in-house resourcing.
Yeah.
If you look back, I don't know if you remember, but if you look back 10, 15 years ago, the ATSs were pretty rudimentary, right? They were basically a kind of Microsoft Access database with a thin veneer put on top of it and some email capability. And we moved from that to arguably where the traditional VMSs are today. Functionality clearly being different, but the ethos being the same. So if you look at the big traditional VMSs today, they're doing that very stereotypical ATS role plus the extra elements on the commercials. What you now see in in-house resourcing is it's moved well beyond that. So you've now got products that are a skillful blend of a number of different facets that are really important to resourcing. So ATS, CRM, talent pooling, talent management, even for in-house resourcing in some cases, a degree of rate management so that you can actually look at pipelining in an appropriate way. So that evolution has helped forward-thinking TA teams on the in-house industry become much more strategically bought in with their organization, because they've got tools that help them do a really holistic and much more strategic role than simply an admin function.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're seeing on the contingent side as well. So I think it's the same evolution. It shouldn't be a hard sell. I think the one challenge that you always have with technology is that some people will always be the leaders and the early adopters. And typically those are going to be either those companies who have got way more forward thinking senior leaders, TA or procurement, running their contingent workforce programs. So people who are really tech savvy. People like David Mason at Santander is a great example. People who really just get the tech bit of the market.
Yeah.
Versus you will have other people who might still have that passion, but they're working in organizations where it takes so long to deliver the change. They'll get there, but by the time they do that, you'll have already evolved anyway, because they'll be 2 or 3 years down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, when you said that and you touched on the people, that now leads me to ask you about this, right? So as a contingent worker, I have never had a home, which is like, okay, I will always sit with the hiring teams, or I will always sit in the procurement or finance, or I will always sit in HR. And my personal view has always been that I should either be part of the hiring manager teams, so the hiring teams, or part of the people team, which is the recruitment HR teams. Because yes, it's a procurement of service, but it's contractual. It's not actually managing people. What is your thoughts on that? Because as a contractor, not really having a home, it's quite disheartening. And more of us are now contractors. So
I think probably two different answers to that. I guess if one bit of the question implicitly is, where should contingent workforce programs sit in an organization? Because that's the same conversation, right? Where does that
Yeah.
sit?
Mm.
You know, we've had previous conversations on this. That my usual soapbox that I'll pull out on this is it absolutely should sit with talent acquisition. This is talent acquisition, procurement. The pipelines of the future, in my opinion, are not going to differentiate as black and white as they do today,
Right.
between people simply based on what contract type they happen to have. And I think the concept of a permanent contract is a bit of a misnomer anyway these days. It doesn't mean what it did. So why would you artificially segment the holistic management of your internal and external talent pipelines by trying to carve off contingent labour and seat it with procurement or even finance, which some people do, just totally commoditizes it. This is about people. And I think the reason why that hasn't happened holistically yet is because of probably more skill sets than anything else. There aren't that many talent acquisition leaders who, going back to our first question, who actually have the depth of expertise or even the natural inclination to want to manage a £600 million a year contingent worker program and everything that comes with that. I spoke at a conference last year, and I was talking about a project I did to implement a massive contingent workforce program into a TA team. And a senior TA leader came up to me afterwards and went, "Oh my goodness, that was really interesting, but most of it went over my head. Please don't tell me I ever have to do anything like that."
Oh my God.
And I thought that was really telling. And I could tell from looking across the room, there's probably only about 20% of that room who were really actively going, either I know what you're talking about, or I'm really engaged in learning more about this. It's a bit scary and it feels really different to what TA talk about, which is attraction, sourcing, employer brand. Arguably, those things need to be talked about more in the contingent space. And then moving on to the second bit of your question, I guess, around where should the contingent workers sit themselves when they come in. I think one of our challenges is IR35 is making this way more difficult for everybody, because people are terrified now to start considering contingent workers as merely an extension of their team in case they end up having a negative impact indirectly to themselves as the employing entity or to the contingent worker. So I'm really worried about that. I think that contingent workers in a modern workforce should be sitting with the people that they're working with every day, wherever that is in the organisation. But I'm really worried that the IR35 changes are going to cause continual deeper divides. And that story that you hear so much of contingent workers feeling like second-class citizens in an organisation, I'm really, really worried about that. And I think that's going to become a blocker to organisations in getting the most out of their contingent workforce.
Understood. Yeah. I've been reading a lot about IR35, especially now it might come into private sector as well. And we're working on a white paper at the moment to simplify the things for businesses and things, but I will definitely take that point on board, because I think as a technology provider, we don't always see it from that lens. But you absolutely, you hit it out the park saying that could be one of the key reasons why, it looks so complex, right? My perception about contingent workforce as an in-house TA leader is that it's so complex. I don't want to do anything with it. It's a problem. I'll just hand it out.
I could legitimately get sued. Let's not do that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so now that we're talking all about these challenges, etc., what do you feel that you have come across actually in terms of the top 3 challenges for businesses? Could be the TA leaders, could be HR communities, could be hiring teams, but what are the top 3 challenges they're facing at the moment when it comes to this total talent augmentation and consolidation?
I think, honestly, challenge number 1 that I come across most often is, where do you start? That's the biggest issue with companies. So many companies that I've worked with really struggle to even understand what is the breadth and scope of their contingent worker population, right down to those definitions of contingent worker types. So who is a contingent worker? A good example of that would be there are companies like IBM, Accenture. There's a whole list of about 50 more companies who integrate themselves in a really intelligent way into organizations, and by accident, if not by design, end up delivering really blended services to organizations. So when is a contingent worker versus not a contingent worker? If I have 100 people for IBM, I'm not picking on them, but if I have 100 people for IBM sitting in my solution architecture team, which ones of those are under a managed service, and how do I know that's a managed service as opposed to a day rate contractor? Is it a statement of work? And if it is a statement of work, is it actually outcome based? Is it not? When you start unpicking that, it feels really complicated. And when you start having those conversations with senior business leaders about the size of their contingent workforce, people can get quite defensive about it for different reasons. Which leads me on to my second, which is the political drivers that sit around people's use of contingent workforce. Let's be honest, most companies up until this point are not utilizing contingent workers because they're incredibly enlightened about the future models of work. Hopefully it will be that way in the future, but it's not there today. They're using contingent workers in some cases because their organization has got to clamp down on headcount, and you've still got to staff your project. So I've got £100 million to spend. I've got to deliver this project, but you're restricting me on how many heads I'm allowed to have. And you count anybody that's on our permanent head count as a head, or even in some cases, you count a day rate contractor through our MSP as a head. But if I procure those same people and I put them under a statement of work, or I call it a managed service, it doesn't count. And I don't want somebody to put my ability to deliver on my objectives at risk. So if a pesky procurement or resourcing person starts sniffing around my resources and trying to tell people they're contingent workers, I'm probably going to need a mindfulness course or two to get over that, because I'm going to feel a little bit stressed about how I'm going to be able to deliver my future services if I end up being under those constraints. I think that's the unintended impact of how businesses set targets or what they focus on. So that can cause a real roadblock for in-house leaders in whatever function they're sitting in trying to bring the organization to a table to discuss a true contingent workforce program. And then I think the third one, honestly, last but not least, is just, it feels complicated. And there are not that many people who sadly have got the expertise to come in and help an organization from scratch set up a contingent workforce program, and it's highly unlikely that most organizations by accident already have those people in their company. So that's quite a difficult place to be, and I think vendors, to their credit, can make it sound even more complicated when they describe. So when you do an exploration exercise to go out and scope the market and start formulating some ideas, when you start hearing how vendors describe the solutions that they would put in, I think that in itself can send people running for the hills.
Absolutely. I think some of the things that I'm hearing as well is how many niche products are out there that it's actually driving in-house teams insane with how many more systems or how many more solutions.
Yeah.
And that is why we're quite sort of happy in sort of driving this ecosystem model. But it also brings me to the point when you said earlier that, it's all too complicated. Maybe what it needs is a definition of, a standardized definition of what is a contingent workforce. Because I think there is a huge confusion. Like, what I think a contingent workforce is: a temp, gig worker, freelancer, interim, contractor, everyone. So for me, that's a total contingent workforce. But what you may, or what an in-house team may think of contingent, like you said, like an SOW versus an independent, is two different things. So I think there might need to be a standardization, a definition. And who do you think, so even if I was to derive a definition and bring it out there, but who is to say that that's going to be adopted?
Well, so it's really funny that you say that. That is literally the first place I start. So when I'm looking at a contingent workforce, even scoping a contingent workforce project, the very first thing that I do is to try to introduce a common lexicon for the organisation to be able to talk about the contingent workforce, because otherwise we use the same terms interchangeably and people mean really different things by it.
Right. Yeah.
And if you go to 3 of the larger financial services companies in the UK today, they all have a definition. It's about 2.5 pages long of all of the contingent worker types, what it means, etc. And they all look identical because I wrote it in one organisation, then I brought it into another organisation, they adopted it, and then one of my learned colleagues nicked it with pride and put it into another FS organisation. So they do exist, and actually it's pretty much the same definitions. But that is absolutely where you need to start with your organisation and be really clear about what you're reporting. The other tip I give people, though, when they're starting there, is set an expectation with your stakeholders on your program up front that these definitions, the buckets that you create against these definitions as you start to sort through your workforce, it will evolve over time. Yeah. So statement of work, as you just referenced, is a really good example. For any company that have not been scrupulous about managing their entire non-permanent workforce before, I would expect that on day one, you're going to have a ton of people in that statement of work or the managed services bucket. When you break it down into one step beyond that, you're going to have an absolute ton of people in non-outcome based statement of work. Now, that's not a category that should even exist, because it's a misnomer in itself. You can't have a non-outcome based statement of work. That's crazy. The whole definition of a statement of work is you're scheduling it against outcomes. Non-outcome statement of work really means that somebody's a day rate contractor. So it's kind of they've been put into that category for one of many reasons, including the ones I've already mentioned. So when you go in on day one, you'll create additional categories within that, like non-outcome based statement of work, that you will park people into, and that becomes the focus of your program to help the business figure out who have you got in that bucket. Have you procured them in the right way? Is there a better way of doing it? Should it be an outcome-based statement of work in that example? In which case, your hiring managers probably need a bit of help, because a lot of your engaging managers have never worked with a true outcome-based statement of work before, and they don't know how to construct it, and they don't know how to receipt against the milestones. So there's a huge amount that sits within there, but start with your definition, set the expectation. It's going to look like a bit of a mess to begin with, and what you end up with in those buckets 2 years later is going to be quite different in composition to what you had on day one.
That's fantastic, because that straightforward answers my solutions question.
2 for 1, Bhumi, 2 for 1.
I know, and so and any size business can basically adopt this, right? Because if they get the definition right, they understand the scope of the work, and then they get them bucketed right, that fits. What about the perception? Because I think to even begin this work, wouldn't I have to change my perception of what I feel of a contingent worker internally? Because if I'm just still going to commoditize a contingent worker, or if I'm still feeling that it's too complex, when, yes, it is complex, but when you sort of remove the layers, it is quite simple as well.
Yeah, it is.
You and I can say that because we've had that experience. Of course, I appreciate that majority of people can't say that. So what about the perception of, wanting to give a better experience, of wanting to humanize this whole process?
That comment I made before about contingent workers feeling like second-class citizens in organizations, that is something I have heard loud and clear in almost every organization that I've worked with. You hear it, and even from really senior contingent workers at times as well, people on £1,000 a day plus, they're still saying that they feel that there is a unfair difference made in terms of access to information that would be helpful for them to deliver on their role. And when you look underneath that, there's huge complexity, Bhumi, around why that is and how we've got there. Some of it, and it's hard to unpick this, some of it is because of pure lack of understanding about the commercial model that exists around constructing a day rate contractor's day rate. So people do a straight line multiplication, and I think it creates a little bit of resentment, maybe even jealousy in organizations. So they look at a day rate contractor who's on £500 a day, they'll do a straightforward multiplication of that, and they'll go, well, hang on a second, that's 2.5 grand a week. That's going to be over 10 grand a month. So all of a sudden I'm looking at somebody who's getting paid 120 grand a year plus, and I'm doing the same job as a permanent person, and I'm getting paid 70 grand or 75 or 80, whatever that is. And they draw a straight comparison. And there's a huge amount of re-education, I think, that's required in small and large organizations that want to embrace agile working and really look at the flexibility of the workforce model in trying to educate the people in their company about how that works. People don't like to talk about money. It's not a very British thing to do, is it? But I think you need to. And when you sit and I've done this even with CEOs and HRDs, I've had to sit and break this down for them and go, right, let me work through contractor calculator, do a really good starting calculator that you can use to explain it to people, but you can create your own as well, to even break that down and say, right, here's what this person has to cover. So they've got to cover their public liability insurance, they've got to cover their own health insurance, they've got to cover their transport, their accounting and bookkeeping, they've got to provide coverage for between assignments, etc., etc., etc. They've also got to pay their own national insurance contributions, if they're paying themselves a salary, which you hope, etc. When you start to bring all of that down, the 20% or so corporate tax rate that people talk about for contractors isn't actually that accurate. It's really discounting it by about 40%.
Absolutely. And the holidays and everything added to that. I mean,
yeah. And I described it. I was out for breakfast with a really good old friend the other day who works in the RPO industry. And I was describing it to him a little bit like when you're a permanent employee, it's a little bit like you're living in your parents' house. So you're an adult, but you're living in your parents' house. They're responsible for making sure that the roof isn't leaking, that there's food in the fridge, that you're looked after, that there's somebody there to wipe your brow if you're not well, etc., etc. And that's great, but you pay a premium for that. So most people might give their parents some money. If you're working as a contractor, though, all of that is entirely your responsibility. There is no safety net. You're on your own. So you've got to think about, if you're an employee, how much is that having that roof over your head and not having to worry about patching the holes in the roof if a storm comes? How much is that worth to you as a permanent employee? And it's quite a lot. And that's why not everybody is suited to contracting work. So honestly, it's not a technical answer to your question, because I don't think that the issue is per se a technical one. I think it is a very fundamental. There are biases against contractor workers and organisations, unhelpfully now, fueled and reinforced by the IR35 discussion. And we need to tackle that. And we also need to do a lot of training with line managers around line of sight management. And if you're a line manager and you can only imagine yourself being successful if you've got 20 people physically sitting in front of you, I'm probably going to suggest you shouldn't be getting particularly great performance reviews, because that doesn't suggest to me you've developed a great set of skills as a leader, unless you're doing a job where literally physically you do need to be there in retail or telephony or such like.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of covered everything that I was, thinking about even before I'd asked this question, from retraining hiring teams to changing perceptions and everything else. So thank you so much. It's I feel like I can keep talking to you about this, and I this is going to be one of the longest ones, but this is so brilliant because we've covered so many topics as well in this. So as a closing remark or as a recommendation, starter for one, what would you like to close this with?
So my request is probably a plea, and it's to CEOs, CPOs, CFOs, HRDs, and also especially talent acquisition leaders. I think this is a topic that people really do need to think about differently, and they need to engage with differently. We've covered lots of the reasons why, but my plea out there would be for organisations, particularly those people in leadership roles, to really just stop for a minute and take a long, hard look at even the simple things around what language do you use when you talk about your non-permanent workers, and how do you consider how you build your staffing model. Is it by accident or by design? Are you using contingent workers to plug a gap, or actually are you looking at a true strategic way of deploying a resourcing model that can actually make your business more successful? So I'd love it to be a more complicated answer than that, because that would suggest to me that we're much further on the maturity curve on this than we are. But sadly, we're not. I really think we're still at that front door of this in many companies.
Wow, that's eye-opening, and thank you so much for your time. This has been brilliant, and I think everyone in HR, recruitment, or hiring teams, and even C-suite that are baffled by this topic should definitely have a look at this. And we'll break it down as well into different questions and sessions, so if someone does not have the chance to go through the full video, they can still get the important bits out of it. Thank you so much. For everyone viewing this as well, you can like, share, and subscribe on our InteriMarket official channels. And Kat, once again, thank you so much for being part of this.
Thanks for asking me.